We're in a very difficult moment. I think the cuts that are coming our way from the federal government are going to be incredibly harmful to Oregonians across our state. We don't need a food insecurity report to know that what's coming will be bad, but we will need good data in order to figure out how we respond as a state to what's headed our way.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Juan Carlos Ordonez with the Oregon Center for Public Policy. Is the Trump administration working to keep the public in the dark as to the extent of hunger in our nation? There's definitely a good reason for thinking that's the case. On the heels of enacting the biggest cuts in history to the programs that help feed struggling families all across the country, the Trump administration has announced that it will no longer issue a yearly report that estimates the amount of food insecurity nationally and at the state level. Earlier today, I spoke with my colleague from the Oregon Center for Public Policy, Tyler Mac Innis, about the Trump administration's announcement that it's canceling the food insecurity report. We discussed why this report is vitally important and what Oregon can do given the situation. Hi, Tyler. How are you?
I'm good, Juan Carlos. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. So, Tyler, the Trump administration recently announced that it will stop counting the number of people who are having a hard time putting food on the table. Tell us what's going on and why this issue matters.
Yeah, well, what's going on is exactly what you just said, Juan Carlos, that the administration has announced that they are planning to stop the collection of data on the state of hunger in the United States, and they will no longer be publishing a regular report that comes out of the Department of Agriculture looking at the extent of food insecurity in communities across the country. This comes right on the tail of the Republican majority in Congress enacting the largest cuts to food assistance programs in our nation's history. So I think any reasonable observer could look at this announcement that we will no longer be collecting data and publishing reports on the state of hunger in the United States. Any reasonable observer could look at that and conclude that this administration is looking to suppress the truth and hiding the results of their actions from the public.
So this U.S. Department of Agriculture report, the last report was supposed to come out last week, but because of the federal government shutdown, it's being delayed. Hopefully it will come out, but do we know if it will actually come out?
We can hope. We don't know right now. I mean, as of right now, we're recording this, in the dark, so to speak. We don't know if and when that report will come out. And so this, hopefully is not a new normal. Hopefully, we'll talk in this conversation about what we might be able to do to chart a path forward. But it's really critical that we have this kind of information to understand the extent to which hunger is pervasive in our community so we can craft policy solutions to address it.
Speaking of the specifics of the report, I wonder if you can sort of give us a sense of what's contained in this U.S. Department of Agriculture report on food insecurity. What kind of data does it give us?
Yeah, so the report in question is data that's collected as part of the current population survey. This is one of the largest surveys that the U.S. Census Bureau conducts on a regular basis. And essentially what they do is when they're surveying families across the country as part of their surveying process, they ask a series of questions at the end about, their ability to put food on the table. They ask things like, in the past 12 months, have you or others in your household ever had to cut the size of your meal because you were worried that you wouldn't have enough money for food, right? So they ask a series of questions along those lines. From that, we get a representative sample and we can extrapolate and make estimates to the extent to which hunger is pervasive in communities across the United States. And it provides us with really essential information. So we know, for instance, from this report that nearly 1 in 7 Oregonians today struggles to put food on the table. They're what the report calls food insecure. And we know from that report as well, for instance, that the share of Oregonians who are experiencing very low food security, they're having skip meals. We can see in the numbers that the share of Oregonians living in that way has increased. So these sorts of data points allow us to get a picture as to like what's happening in communities across Oregon and across the country, and think about, from a policy perspective, how are we going to make sure that we can better enable Oregonians to put food on the table. So it allows us to craft policy responses um, to the fact that people are having a hard time putting food on the table. But without that information, again, we will be in the dark. And all this is happening when, as we've mentioned, the largest cuts to food assistance in our nation's history just occurred this past summer. And we're amidst a government shutdown where the federal government announced just a few days ago that states shouldn't expect to see their next month allotment of SNAP dollars because the federal government is shut down. So we have hundreds of thousands of Oregonians who, in just a matter of a week or so, aren't going to be getting the food assistance that they need to be able to feed themselves and their families. So not have this kind of information about how these policy choices at the federal level are impacting communities here in Oregon, it's really devastating for us as policymakers and advocates to be able to respond appropriately.
I definitely want to come back and talk about the cuts to nutrition assistance that Congress has enacted. But before we get to that, I wonder how this information in this food insecurity survey has been useful in the past. How have advocates and policymakers put it to use?
Yeah, well, I think maybe we should take a step back and kind of talk about the history of the report in and of itself. And there was a moment in time where we didn't have a report of this kind at the federal level. So we don't have to look that far back into our history to understand what it means to not have this kind of data readily available. In the 1980s, there was a task force on food assistance convened under President Reagan that was tasked with looking at the extent of food insecurity and hunger in the United States. And one of the things that task force brought up in its final report was that the lack of data made it really difficult for them as an entity to come up with policy solutions. They said something to the effect of the lack of data was contributing to a climate in which policy discussions become unhelpfully heated and unsubstantiated assertions are substituted for hard information. That's a quote from the findings of that report. Many years later, the USDA published the first of the food insecurity reports that it's been publishing for the last quarter century or so. And in that first USDA report, which was published in late 1999, Oregon came out worst in terms of food insecurity. We're actually ranked number one in terms of most food insecure in the country. And this, I think, was quite alarming to Oregonians, to policymakers here in the state, to advocates. And it really catalyzed policymakers to take action. And in the years since, Oregon has made really significant strides in terms of making food assistance more accessible, making it so that families who are trying to access food pantries, for instance, are able to do so more easily. We really have built out an infrastructure and made important policy changes that make it easier for families who need a little extra help putting food on the table, make it easier for them to find that help. And we may not have done that if we didn't see that information in that first food insecurity report that came out of the USDA. And so I think it's really important to underscore that. I think it really highlights the importance that good nonpartisan data can have, right, in terms of catalyzing us as a state to take action in helping families meet their basic needs.
So let's go back to the question of the cuts that Congress enacted in July to nutrition assistance, in addition to other critical programs like Medicaid, but certainly nutrition assistance has taken a beating in the tax and budget bill passed by Congress a few months ago. I wonder if you can describe to us the severity of those cuts, how deep they are.
Yeah, they're incredibly deep, as we mentioned earlier. That's the largest cut to SNAP and to food assistance in our country's history. And it's important to kind of situate those cuts in that broader package you mentioned. This is the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, or HR1. It's a giant package of things, but primarily it's trillions in tax cuts, primarily for the wealthy and corporations. And Republicans in Congress attempt to pay for these things by making really drastic, significant cuts to essential social service programs that Oregonians rely on to meet their basic needs. And those are primarily Medicaid in terms of accessing healthcare, and SNAP in terms of being able to have a little bit of extra help to put food on the table. The cuts to SNAP are incredibly severe. It's hundreds of billions of dollars over the next several years. We'll see in terms of cuts to the SNAP program. In Oregon, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of Oregonians who are going to see their food assistance either reduced or eliminated entirely as a result of the cuts that are coming to the SNAP program. I should note too the way in which a large portion of these cuts are taking place is the reinstitution and the expansion of work requirements within the SNAP program. And essentially, these say that you, as a recipient of food assistance, need to be working a certain number of hours every month or performing a certain number of work-related activities in a certain month in order to be deserving of food assistance. For some individuals, or what are called able-bodied adults without dependents, for individuals that are in that category, even if they're meeting those work requirements, they're still limited to only 3 months of food assistance in a given 3-year window. So we're talking about like real limitations in terms of people's ability to access just a little bit of help so that they can feed themselves. So these are really severe cuts. And in 6 counties across the state, those work requirements for ABODs, able-bodied adults without dependents, those are already in effect. So we're seeing some of these cuts already rolling out today. And we'll see more and more of these work requirements and other cuts to the program coming online in 2026. So these are really severe cuts to the program. As I mentioned, they will impact hundreds of thousands of Oregonians and their ability to put food on the table. And again, all of this is so that we can afford massive tax cuts primarily for the wealthy and corporations who don't need that assistance.
On the heels of these very drastic cuts, the administration is declaring that it will no longer publish the main way we track food insecurity in the country and at the state level. So what are the implications of that decision? What does it mean going forward?
It means we will have to find an alternative, right? I think we will have to figure out a path forward as a state to collect this kind of data and analyze the numbers ourselves. But thinking big picture, not only is this happening at the same time as cuts from the One Big Beautiful Bill are starting to roll out, but as we mentioned earlier, we're amidst a federal government shutdown. If the federal government remains closed through the beginning of next month, the Trump administration has announced to states that they should not expect anyone on their SNAP program to receive food assistance next month if the federal government remains closed. So not only do we have these massive cuts to the program heading our way, but we also have the federal government refusing to disperse funds to folks who are on the program currently, who are needing that money in November to be able to feed themselves and their families. this is exactly the time that we would want the ability to look at the numbers and understand what happens when policymakers make these kinds of choices at the federal level, when we make these kinds of drastic cuts to programs, or when we cut people off from the SNAP rolls because of a federal government shutdown. What does that do in terms of people's ability to put food on the table? This is exactly the kind of moment where we would want to be able to look at those numbers and understand those choices so that we can make better policy decisions in the future. And so to not have the data potentially to be able to do that analysis is very harmful to us, I think, as a society. And so we do need to be thinking about what are the alternative paths forward. And so, Oregon, whether it's us as a state or whether, as a region, we need to be thinking about ways in which we can continue to collect this data and look into the numbers that we can craft policy responses that make sense for Oregon.
And these deep cuts to nutrition assistance and the potential impact of the federal shutdown in terms of people being able to receive nutrition assistance, it's also coming in the context of tariffs increasing the cost of living for families. It's coming at a time when, even before the tariffs, inflation was already running high, certainly higher than has been the case in the past. So families already being squeezed by higher prices, plus taking away nutrition assistance just seems a recipe for disaster.
It does. And in fact, we can go back to that original food insecurity report that was published in the late 90s, where Oregon came out as the most food insecure state in the country. And one of the drivers that was mentioned in that report as to why Oregonians were more likely to struggle putting food on the table was, higher cost of living, right? Like families had other household expenses like housing and other things that made it harder to then afford groceries. And so we take that into today's context where, as you mentioned, tariffs and other things are driving up the cost of living for families. Taking away that food assistance is going to be devastating for families who are struggling with, increasing rent costs, increasing utility bill costs. I mean, you name it, childcare, right? Like the cost of living today is incredibly expensive, especially for families who are working for low wages. And so to take away food assistance in this moment in particular is a recipe for disaster.
So this USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture report on food insecurity, it's not the only piece of information, data traditionally published by the federal government that the Trump administration has threatened to take away, to basically cancel. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a larger trend, right, to kind of suppress data and information. I mean, one example is the firing of the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics a few months ago. The Trump administration fired the head of the BLS because they didn't like the numbers in the monthly jobs report that were coming out, right? So we see this as a pattern with this administration, that data that isn't there to support their narrative or their worldview, or whatever you want to call it, it's suppressed, it's undermined, it's politicized, right? So this is just another example of this administration attacking nonpartisan data that policymakers and Americans across the board rely on. And I think it's important to note that these kinds of data points are really essential for just a functioning democratic society, right? Like, we need to make good public policy that works for all of us, and we can't do that if we don't know what's happening to Americans, and if we don't know what's happening in communities across our country. So we are really reliant on good information in order to make good public policy choices. So to suppress data like that, to politicize data like that is really harmful.
You already touched on this a little bit, but in a piece that you wrote recently, you suggested that Oregon should begin to collect its own data on food insecurity. I wonder if you can say more about what that might look like, your policy recommendation.
Yeah, I should say, this is a very much like a high level recommendation. I think this is something that we would love to see partnership on with a variety of stakeholders who have a vested interest in this kind of information. But the core of the idea is kind of what we've been discussing here is, the elimination of this report at the federal level is incredibly harmful for Oregon and for states across the country when it comes to our ability to address hunger in our communities. And so if the federal government isn't going to be collecting that data, publishing this information, then we as a state need to figure out a way to fill that void. We can't just allow for this data to go away. So the piece that we published recently calls on the governor and policymakers at the state level to find a path forward on collecting this information at the state level, and Oregon publishing its own version of this food insecurity report. I think this is the kind of thing that we would want folks who work more closely in the food security space, food banks of the world, healthcare systems, a variety of stakeholders to really help think through what this could look like. But this idea, could also help us look at a variety of things, and not just hunger, right? But a variety of things that Oregonians are facing when it comes to their challenges making ends meet. And so we're really hoping that we can find a path forward on maintaining good data for policymaking purposes here in the state of Oregon. And that really is the crux of the argument in that piece.
Tyler, any final thoughts you want to share with us regarding the outlook for food insecurity in our state, given the national picture, and what we might do here in Oregon in that regard?
We're in a very difficult moment. I think the cuts that are coming our way from the federal government are going to be incredibly harmful to Oregonians across our state. We don't need a food insecurity report to know that what's coming will be bad, but we will need good data in order to figure out how we respond as a state to what's headed our way. And so I think I hope that this can be a rallying cry, so to speak, for policymakers in Oregon, for advocates, and just for everyday Oregonians who care about this issue, to make sure that we don't just allow this data to go away, that we make sure that Oregon finds a way to continue to collect this data and make it accessible publicly, because we're going to need to figure out a way to respond to what's happening at the federal level. And we're going to need good data to be able to do that.
Data is definitely essential for figuring out solutions. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for explaining this to us.
Thanks, Juan Carlos.